And was that similar to what you were doing when you were working at Apple and Amazon as the security person on the project?
Yeah. So when I worked at Amazon, I worked at like the central like AppSec team. So anytime I kind of like ran out of uh, work to do with one team, like I had audited all their code, I'd move on to another one. But at Apple, it was different because I was embedded on the team. So when I would audit the majority of their code and ask what next, I started thinking of just the craziest things, like, well, what if someone like repels from the ceiling into our data servers, uh, and like pulls a hard drive? Like, what happens then? Thinking about like more holistically operational security, right? Like, who has all the keys to access everything? What combination of people does it take to, uh, you know, materialize an insider threat that can just kind of walk away with some sensitive information? Like when you have time at your disposal, you can start thinking of these crazy scenarios, and actually some of them have some value. Like we found some, uh, infrastructure engineers that had way too much permissions, and actually we looked at our like infrastructure and saw that there's like hundreds of people that can access it. So some of our trust assumptions about how we were running things were actually untrue.
So it was a lot of threat modeling as well.
Yeah, I'm a pretty firm believer that security engineering is really just threat modeling, um, and then there's a couple extra steps just to verify your threat model. But the core of what makes up security work is just thinking about threats.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point actually, because in Web3 I find most of us just focus on the smart contract security side, and there's a whole other side that not many people are really focused on.
Yeah, and I think we see some of the more devastating hacks due to like violated security assumptions, right? Like um, just traditional OPSEC things like road and bridge, where it's just the keys weren't properly protected. Um, it was kind of an infrastructure failure. Someone hadn't really put enough thought into what happens in these scenarios, and is there a defense in depth in place? Um, so yeah, I think people tend to focus in the Web3 space just on the application security, and that can really get you into trouble, especially because most projects have some sort of kind of uh, permission system where like they own the proxy contract, or there's like a small quorum of people that can update the contracts, or they just own the front end, right? It's just pushed through Vercel or posted on AWS or something, and not really knowing what you're doing in terms of security can really compromise the entirety of your project.
Yeah, just speaking of front end, I'm not sure if you saw this, but just literally 30 minutes before we jumped on, the Balancer put out a tweet saying their front end is being attacked and don't interact with it. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that, but I mean, I feel like we've seen it a couple of times in the Web3 space. I think like OpenSea had something a few months back where some there like just an engineer that had access to the front end. I think it was like a contractor or something. Just added some code to like replace the like the smart contract interactions, the DApp interface, right? And it's just that easy. Like you spend all your time focusing on the hardness and the security of smart contracts, uh, but they're just one aspect of a whole ecosystem. Like it, you in the Web3 space, I feel like we've gotten a little lopsided on AppSec. When you think about like Web2, you've got network security, infrastructure security, physical security, operational, and AppSec, and these things kind of get more or less equal attention. I think probably network security, infrastructure security, maybe a little bit lopsided in Web two for a lot of reasons. But then looking at Web three, I feel like it's 90% AppSec is the focus. When the hacks we're seeing are not 90% AppSec related.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's more like 50%. There are a lot of private keys compromise and infrastructure side issues that are causing hacks. Do you think there is a market in people doing infrastructure type of work in Web3 security?
Yeah, actually, before I started what I'm doing now, I wanted to like break out into the Web3 space as an auditor of sorts, doing freelance work. And while I was learning kind of the smart contract aspect of things, so I could go from the Web 2 space to the Web 3 and have all those gaps filled. I was kind of applying my operational security knowledge because there's not really much of a difference between Web 2 and Web 3 OPSEC. It's all kind of the same concept. So I actually started doing some OPSEC reviews for different Web 3 companies. I think there's a pretty good demand for it. Like I actually found a few worrying things. I think the biggest thing that people would be surprised about when you kind of peek under the hood at not just Web 3 companies but companies in general is no one really takes the time to secure their cloud infrastructure. And in Web 3, I feel like teams grow really fast, and when your team grows really fast, you're taking on a lot of OPSEC risks. Like the more people you have in your organization, the more risk there is. Just due to like insider threats and operations expanding to have more like potential attack vectors. But when you're growing super quickly, as things do, especially in like a bull market in Web 3, I think companies will explode from like 5 to 50 people. Seems like overnight. You're taking on a lot of undue risk. So people will do things like just have every engineer in the company give them the access to deploy to production or to access the production database and the encryption keys and all of that, just because they're building so quickly. But when you actually deploy a DeFi project and actually have people using it, that's when you get into trouble.
Mm. Do you think that's a symptom of Web3 just growing really fast? Like we get bull markets and teams just explode, and then we get bear markets and they just separate. So do you think that's a symptom of that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, I mean, it probably happens in the Web 2 space as well, but I think the cycles that we see in Web 3, uh, and maybe things in the future will be a little bit different. Like there's some lessons learned, and maybe things will even out. But I feel like 1 or 2 years ago, VC money was being pumped into everything, and then people go and spend that money, and they grow super fast, and that definitely did materialize this problem. I think in a bigger way than we've really seen in the Web 2 space in the past few decades, really. Maybe since like the .com boom, when a lot of stuff was being learned about security.
Hmm. And why did you stop doing the infrastructure type of reviews for Web3 companies? As you said, there's actually quite a lot of demand for that.
Yeah. So there's a few reasons. Like the main thing I wanted to do was get into like the auditing space. As I said, I started learning Solidity and learning about the EVM, and wanted to just do what I was doing, which is application security, and it's what I've always loved to do. So that was really the reason why I moved away from the OPSEC reviews. Uh, but as I started to explore that path, I realized that there in Web 3 there was a lot of kind of friction getting started as a freelancer. Um, there was a lot that I didn't know where I needed to look for answers. There's a lot of kind of foreign tools that I felt were pretty clunky, uh, and I think there was just some things I wanted to be different before I actually started doing audits full time. I wanted things to be a little bit easier, and this was especially true when I was doing the OPSEC audits. Um, like the number one pain point I've always had is writing reports. I think anyone who's ever done an audit definitely shares this pain. Uh, no matter how much you kind of automate the process away, it's still like the most painful part of the auditing. Like you can do 50% of the audit is just pure security work, and the other 50% is just like technical writing.
Yeah, it's a context switch there, right? You really have to change your mind from like left brain to right brain when you go from technical to report writing.
Yeah, yeah, and it turns out that OPSEC reviews are pretty much 90% writing. So it wasn't exactly the most glamorous thing. I do think there's a huge need for it, and people should definitely invest in it more. But it wasn't something that I was excited about at the time.
And just going back to the sort of tooling available in Web3, and there are very little tooling available. Just comparing back to when you were doing security auditing at Apple and Amazon, what sort of tools did you have available there that is not available in Web3 auditing?
It's a good question. I mean, auditing in the Web 2 space is very different than Web 3 because there's a lot of mechanics to go into the operation of a Web 2 app. Whereas on Web 3, you really have just kind of this one black box. Here's your input, and here's the state change. Um, and, there's not a lot in between that you need to kind of put yourself in between and think about how things are working. I mean, in the Web 2 space, you have like your front end web page, you'll have your backend server, you have all your sidecars, your databases. So auditing is really it in that aspect. Um, Kind of injecting yourself in between each of those different things, manipulating uh, how the client talks to the server, for example, and then seeing what happens. And I think in Web 3 we don't really focus too much on the tooling aspect because I guess it doesn't really apply as much. The most common tools I would use would be things like Burp Suite, where I would kind of intercept uh, stuff from the client and the server, and then manipulate it, use it to like kind of crawl uh, the website and see what hidden pages there were that I could kind of look into. I'd also use tools to kind of automatically look for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, so sort of like a lot of dynamic testing. And there was static analysis tools like Fortify for Java, for example, and I would use those. But the way I would use them is not really how a lot of static analysis tools get, I guess, marketed in the Web 3 space, where it's they're trying to find vulnerabilities for you. I think the way I ended up using them was knowing that 99.9% of the results were false positives. I would just kind of use those tools to try to give me a good direction, right? And to kind of tell me where are the complexities in the code base. What's maybe it's a lot of false positives, but the false positives are at least telling you that there's some complex things going on, in this area of the code. So it'd be a good way to kind of get started. And then beyond that, just like the testing tools, right, that a developer normally uses.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking of a bit of an idea around Burp Suite. I thought it might be interesting to have a plugin that you can interact with the front end Web3 protocols and then somehow turn that into a POC in Foundry or something like that. I'm not sure if something similar is possible, but that would really make writing POCs much easier because we have to spend a lot of time just setting up the infrastructure side for the smart contracts.
Yeah, so it's like you have like I guess like a web page for a DApp, and you use kind of Burp Suite to intercept and see what the interactions are, and then you can create a POC from that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I think that's a good idea, and I've been thinking about POCs a lot lately too, because I feel like that's one of um, the big areas where we can put in a lot of automation, and it's kind of strange to me that we don't have a lot of it at this point. Um, I find myself putting together like using Tenderly or something to just kind of probe contracts and see what works. And then after I've done all that work of doing this like dynamic testing, I'll then say, okay, now I need to do like remember everything I just did and go write it into proof of concept, rather than having something to just like record everything and then put that into a repeatable test.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that something like that would be super useful.
Yeah, I think that the future is definitely going to be more tools that uh, increase the I guess usability and accessibility of these like security insights and these like tasks you have to do as part of the auditing process. Um, that was one of the reasons why when I got into this space, I was like, oh, there's hardly any of this is automated, and it's just going to be a ton of manual work over and over again. And actually, then I was like, let me try to just automate some of this stuff, and then maybe once I've done that, I can come back and do audits, which I originally wanted to do.
Yeah, I actually think that the manual stuff makes things a bit more interesting. I mean, at least that's how I sort of felt when I first got into the Web3 security, because I was using Burp Suite and a lot of tools in my day job as well. And just doing things more manually, doing the code reviews, it felt more interesting to me that way, like a more of a mental sort of challenge.
Yeah, and I feel like that sentiment is shared uh, amongst a lot of security professionals. I feel like the more experienced of a security person I talk to, the less they rely on different tools, and really just think the most powerful way of finding vulnerabilities at analyzing security is just manual review. And that's also what I saw in kind of the Web 2 space. Like, tooling is not super well utilized in the Web 2 space either. A lot of the engineers there just focus entirely on manual review.
Yeah, I think tooling gets the average level of security up a lot, but to go to that top level of security, you still want to do manual reviews.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. The top level of security is always going to be professionals. Doing things as a tool is just never will really be able to do. I mean, tooling. I don't think tooling's ever going to be able to catch up with really the cutting edge of security. And I don't think I've really heard of a tool that finds like a 0 day, right? That was super impactful or anything. And I wouldn't expect that to happen anytime soon. Even with the advent of AI, I don't think that we'll move away from manual reviews being king for a while.
Mm. Yeah, same. I think the same sentiment. Just going back to when you were working at Apple, how did you get get involved in Web3 in the first place?
Yeah, actually, so I think the first time I really interacted with Web3, I say interacted, but all I did was buy some Bitcoin in ETH. That was probably, I don't know, 2015, 2016, sometime around there. And I bought it, it went up a little bit, and it went back down, and I got kind of bored. I was like, okay, that was a fun ride. I don't think this is for me. And then fast forward a couple years, um, and I moved away from being a passive investor to being more active. And around that time, I don't know if you remember the whole like GameStop um, short squeeze thing that was going on.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, I remember that.
yeah, so I was one of the people kind of riding that wave early on. Like I had heard the whispers, I guess, and um, kind of agreed with the sentiment of everyone, and I bought some stock early. And I wouldn't say I'm a very good trader because I rode it all the way up, and then I rode it all the way back down. And at one point, I think my gains were something like 150%, um, and I was loving it. And then it went down to about 10%. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't lose money, uh, but that whole thing kind of jaded me on the traditional finance system. I felt like that was like super unfair what happened. That people can just hit the pause button and manipulate markets. Uh, and so after that happened, and crypto was also pumping at the time. So after that happened, I was like, okay, let me go look at crypto again. And so I started buying some ETH, um, and then DeFi started to really, you know, a lot of things were happening there. I think we were seeing a big wave of a lot of things and super high yields as well, which is something that got me interested in it. But also like these more complex financial instruments where you have like these farming mechanisms and people are staking their tokens to maximize yield, and that to me, like the just the mathematic aspect of it, seemed really seemed really interesting, um, because it's something that you can actually see and prove. Like this is how the system works. So I started, investing in random things. Didn't make any money, but I had a lot of fun learning about the technology, and I started reading some of the smart contract code, and I just assumed, kind of going in, that everyone in the Web3 space, uh, they're gambling essentially with, uh, millions of dollars of their users' money, and so they must be secure, right? Like they must have good practices in place. They're experts at security, because how could they sleep at night if they weren't? But when I read the code, I saw that there was many flaws. So I sold my tokens for those projects, and would just like write up a security report quickly for the the devs, and say like, hey, this is, you've got these vulnerabilities here. You should really do something about it. And so they then would offer me a bounty, for reporting that. Not that I really expected it, but when I kind of showed them what I was doing, uh, which I was really just doing for research purposes, and to kind of learn a little bit more. I realized that you can make money as a freelancer pretty easily doing this. And then I also learned about things like Code Arena and Unify, and that's when I decided that, okay, this is super interesting. The stuff I'm doing in Web 2 is kind of boring compared to this. Thinking about, for the 100th time, just going to work and thinking, how can someone attack the same set of 5 applications this team owns, was not super exciting to me anymore. And that's when I so slowly started to uh, lose my ability to do my job in Web 2 anymore. Web 3 got more exciting.
Yeah, the millions of dollars at risk aspect is, yeah, it just makes Web3 so exciting. So the gambling aspect introduced you to Web3, and the mathematics and challenge side made you stay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Did you get wrecked in any of the protocols, or were you fast enough to pull your money out before once you realized there were security vulnerabilities?
Uh, well, I wouldn't say I got wrecked from any security vulnerabilities, um, but I'm also not a very good trader. So I did okay, but I don't think I really made any money at all, even in the bear market, except when you think about um, the ETH. Just the ETH value, I think, kind of stayed more or less consistent. But what did
Mm.
happen was, I was one of the projects I had bought some tokens for, and I was LPing for, had a rug pull. Like I think they did actually have some security vulnerability or something, or maybe it was an insider. I never really looked into it too much, but I just remember waking up one day and I was looking at Zapper, and kind of checking out my LP positions, and I saw that the token pool was like super super lopsided, and Zapper was reporting something like 3,000% gain on the token, just because all the liquidity, like everyone had pulled their ETH out, and there was a lot of like weird volume, and so it seemed like the tokens had potentially a lot of value. And at first, I was like, "Oh man, like this crypto thing is crazy. Now my tokens are like I'm going to be rich. Let me sell them right now." And I went to go try and sell, and what I actually got was pennies. And I was like, "What? What's going on?" Um, so that was kind of a wild ride. Uh, but they did reissue the token and make everyone whole. It didn't have the same value down the line, but I didn't end up getting wrecked, I would say.
Interesting story. So was it 2020, 2021 when you started getting involved in the security side of Web3?
Yeah, 2021 when I started exploring it, just as a hobbyist.
And how did you manage to transition your skills from the Web 2 auditing on the Web 3 side? Was there what was the most useful aspect that you had gained from your experience back working at Apple?
Yeah, I think that security engineering is almost a universal skill. Just kind of like development is a universal skill where you can go from writing in one language or framework to another pretty easily. And so just having that like baseline, security engineering procedure so well defined in my head, I think was what really helped me. And for me, I am a huge threat modeler. Um, I like firmly believe that anyone who is not writing a threat model is not doing security auditing properly. And I actually kind of don't understand it super well because when I first started as an engineer, before I knew really what the value of threat modeling was, and why I should use it, I would do these audits and I would kind of question, well, how do I know when I'm done? Like, how do I know when I've thought about all the security aspects and gone and reviewed them? And I remember just kind of asking, more senior security engineers, like, how do I know when to stop working or like when to stop trying to find ways to break it? And their answer was like, well, you have to think about every single scenario, everything that could possibly go wrong. And then if you've validated all of those and there's no other possible potential scenario, no possible security impact that could happen, then you're done. But you can never get there with absolute certainty. So I think the thing that I really benefit from coming into the Web3 space is just kind of having that knowledge of you're never going to know everything, and you can take like these baby steps um, in auditing something new, but you can really help yourself out by relying heavily on threat modeling and just looking at existing work and like taking the lessons learned. So if you look at like Solo did, for example, and you're doing a C4 contest of like an ERC 721 token, just look at what those vulnerabilities were, then build your threat model out of that. Like, well, what if all those vulnerabilities were present here? So it's a combination then of knowing the process of threat modeling and having a good vocabulary for building that threat model. And then the verification part is, I think, after that, pretty easy. You just find a way to um, either confirm that threat's not present or confirm that you actually can attack it and write a POC or something.
That's actually a pretty good description of auditing process. People talk about creativity a lot and how to increase creativity around finding bugs. I think, yeah, what you described, just spending some time thinking about the threat model and knowing what's possible in terms of hacks in the past, like, for example, reading past audit reports, then, yeah, that really increases your your sort of ideas that you can generate while you're auditing.
Yeah, and I think I really like the advent of AI for this as well. I think that AI gets a lot of flack for its use in the security space, especially in the Web3 security space, because it doesn't do a good job of finding vulnerabilities. But I think, even outside of auditing, whenever I'm thinking about something or trying to understand something, um, like when I get a legal document from a lawyer or something, I'll just feed it into OpenAI and say, what does this mean, right? And it does a really good job actually of deciphering legalese and saying in plain English, here's what this means for you as a person about to sign this document. And so I love to then put a complex code base into OpenAI and say, explain to me what this does. I feel like it's a pretty good shortcut to understanding a lot. But I also think it has a lot of power in terms of threat modeling. Because when you think about threat modeling, um, the way I used to do threat modeling at my job when I worked at Apple and also at Amazon, is I would work with the software engineers and I would say, I'm going to come to a meeting a week from now with a list of all the threats I could possibly think of for this application we're going to review, and you can do the same. And then we're going to put our heads together, brainstorm, and like compile a super long list from different perspectives. And I think that AI can be basically that person for you, right? You should definitely always work with a developer if you can to build a threat model, because no one's going to understand the project more than them. But I think that the key thing about security is uh, getting as many diverse perspectives as possible. Kind of like the Swiss cheese problem, right? Everyone's going to have holes in their approach, but you stack them up enough, and you're going to cover those holes. And AI is definitely super valuable. I think is kind of like an assistant in that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard anyone talk about using AI to do threat modeling. People always talk about using AI to find vulnerabilities, and obviously it sucks at finding vulnerabilities, so people dismiss it as being not useful in the space.
Yeah, I think in general too, like regardless of security, I feel like people try to get AI to do too much, right? Um, they throw a super high level problem at it, and then they see that it sucks at it, and like, oh, AI kind of sucks. It's not ready to help with this application. But I think the best approach is to really break down what a problem is and use AI to solve those kind of simpler challenges, and then you can string all those things together. I like to think of there's like that Rick and Morty episode with the Meeseeks, and I don't know if you've seen it, but two of the characters, they Beth and Summer, they ask their Meeseeks to do pretty simple, doable things, and then Jerry asks the Meeseeks, take two swings off my golf game or something, and the Meeseeks like just can't accomplish it, right? So it's kind of like that approach. If you ask it to do something more specific, of I want my uh, specific stat in golf, right? I want like to work on my swing a little bit better, right? So that I can increase my accuracy a little bit, right? If you ask it to do that tiny thing versus I just want to be better at golf, like I want to be twice as good, you're going to have a better result. And then you can ask it to help you with all these different tiny things, string those together, and then you've got basically the outcome you were looking for in the beginning when you ask it this larger problem.
Mm. Yeah, I think the joke was actually Beth asked the Meeseeks to make her a whole woman, and that was a more
Yeah,
abstract problem than Jerry's take two swings off his golf swing. But yeah, yeah, I get your point. It's like kind of like how people prompt add the prompt "Let's think step by step" as part of the AI prompt, and then it actually it gives you a better response when you put that, which is pretty strange.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's this whole concept of how to Google something. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach someone who's never really used a computer much how to Google something, and they are Googling the problem, looking for the problem rather than looking for the solution. I think AI is kind of the same way. Like you need to prompt it in a certain way um, when you kind of understand how it works. That it takes your input and it gives you the highest probability expected output from that. You need to make sure you're providing something that's going to get you exactly what you're expecting because the AI doesn't have this general intelligence that's going to inform it that you probably you because of the context of this probably think uh, you know or probably are expecting the output to be in a certain way. It's just not that intelligent, so you have to make sure you know how to use the tool. I think we're going to see perhaps in the future, just like we've seen classes in using Google, we'll have classes for people to learn how to use AI.
Mm, yeah, definitely. So you left your job at Apple and you essentially became a sort of freelancer for infrastructure and Web3 security reviews, and you pretty much really quickly started to find bugs in real smart contracts as well and getting some bug bounties. Now, so why did you decide to then create Audit Wizard rather than sort of continue that path as a freelancer?
Yeah. Um, so Audit Wizard was born out of the kind of friction I experienced getting started in the space. Um, I wanted to use a lot of the tools because I think that Solidity and really Web3 lends itself well to automated tooling much more than the Web2 space ever did. Because the when you think about just smart contract risk, ignoring kind of the operational side of things, it is really a pure application security problem. Like there's a lot of, I guess, determinism in the kind of vulnerabilities that you find in this security patterns that are present. And so I saw that and thought that okay, tooling can be much more powerful here than it is in the Web2 space, and I want to use a lot of the tools. And I'd go try them out. Like I use like Slither and Mithril and things like that, and like tools to graph Solidity code. I think that was one big thing that I wanted because when I see a large code base, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And viewing it at a bird's eye view would help me out a lot more. And those tools are all command line, and they have like just JSON blobs as output, or just a text based UI that's awful to interact with. I know there's a lot of people in the in the space that do everything from terminal, right? But I'm definitely not one of those people. I like to have a nice graphical user interface, uh, and so like the scanning tools that I would use at Web2, I said before they're mostly false positives and there's limited value. But at least when I'd use those, they have a GUI with them, and each result, I could see like layered on top of the code, and I can go and it would like highlight the code or put like a squiggly line under it, and I can say like, okay, this specific thing has that issue. And then when I went to use Slither, um, I would have to kind of have my code pulled up beside it and decipher the output, and then go find those lines and go look over here, and then look back at it and say like, what is it trying to tell me here? Um, and then my approach of using static code analysis tools to kind of highlight the most complex areas of the code or areas that I want to focus more on didn't really work because I had to go through dozens of uh, findings and then manually kind of highlight that chunk of the code. So I stopped using them, and then ended up doing everything manually and decided that I didn't really want to continue that. I think there's a lot of potential to automate a lot of the steps that I was doing, and then that's kind of when I met my co-founder, and I took kind of griped to him. I'm trying to do freelance auditing, and here's the pain points I see. Like, man, I wish I could just build a tool to fix all these things. And he was like, well, why don't we do that? Um, which seemed like a crazy idea at the time to me. I didn't really know exactly how we'd accomplish it or what it would look like. I think the earliest days of Audit Wizard was building it as just a collaborative platform that was open source and a public good. But then we realized that the amount of work that needs to be put into it was not really well supported as a public good. We, worked on it. I think at in the evening every day after work for like a year before it became something uh, more material, right? Like it had many different forms until we got to what it is now, uh, you know. And so that's kind of how we got to where we are. And I think that at some point I'll go back to doing auditing, or at least I'm telling myself that I'm just waiting for Audit Wizard to have this and that in it, and then I'll have everything that I ever wanted to do audits. And then I can finally go back and start from the beginning where I wanted to be and do those audits. Maybe that day won't come because I'm so invested in building this now, but that's definitely the goal I'm building towards.
Mm, nice. You mentioned something quite interesting earlier about the traditional security tools highlighting you the part of the code where potential complexity or issues might be. Uh, do you think that in Web3 the code bases are so much smaller that you don't really need to highlight it? Because I have a lot of people in this space who talk about reading line by line, and you can actually do that in smart contracts, right? But I don't think that approach would be even feasible in the traditional software side because the applications are just so much bigger.
Yeah, I think you're not wrong. Like if I remember doing a when Auto Wizard was getting started, we were bootstrapping by doing some audits, and I wasn't ready to do smart contract audits. So we were doing like one of the audits we did was of the Slingshot mobile wallet. Um, we did an AppTech review of their whole code base. And I just remember looking at it. It's like this complex mobile app, and I remember opening it up and being so uh, being so like, where do I start on all of this? There's probably 400 different files, and each of them has, I don't know, 100 to 1,000 different lines of code. Some of them were, much bigger if they were a core component. And so dissecting all of that is quite the daunting challenge, and that's where the automated tooling does come in. And so yeah, I think in the smart contract world, it is a little bit simpler of a problem because your infrastructure is not kind of tied with the actual logic. Um, you don't have your like front end code mixed in with the smart contract code, right? They're two like completely separate things, and you can just think about the logic that's going to be executed. What are the steps there? And I think that can make things a little bit simpler. But that said, there are definitely some applications out there, some smart contract systems that can be quite complex. Like if you ever looked at maybe like Uniswap code. The thing is that the code itself may not be uh, tons and tons of lines, but it's highly complex and it's doing a lot of things. So the density of complexity is definitely way higher. So I think that sec- highlighting those lines can have a little bit of value to basically do what I said. Like you almost produce like a heat map, right, of what are some of the more complex areas of code. Um, I mean, I think static code analysis has two benefits. One, like maybe it does find something. It's usually the low hanging fruit, but the other aspect is as I've said, finding that more complex chunk of code. So for me, I always want to have that kind of visual representation. And I also think that the future of static code analysis tools is going to be more open and collaborative. So far we've seen like, so take Slither for example. How many like extra detectors in the community can you really think of, right? Like, for me, there's only one set that I know of, which is Slytherin, right? So some team put together some additional things that they wanted to put in Slither, some additional detections, and then you can go out of your way and use that. But what if the future was something like you can write your own rules, right? So you, as an auditor, as you go through the project, you find some vulnerabilities based on some pattern. Maybe you can, in the same way you take that and write a proof of concept test, you would take that and write a scanning rule, and now you have this kind of reproducible system for when you open a new code base that you're going to audit. Automatically, it can find a lot of those areas of the code that you're most interested in. Maybe those rules don't materialize as vulnerabilities right away, but maybe you can write rules to say, like, I want to know where there's an entry point in the application that takes user input and has a state change to the contract storage, right? Like, you can write a rule there, and then that's when you'll want to definitely highlight that area of the code. It makes that feature, I think, more user-friendly.
Yeah, it can almost act like a checklist of some sorts to alert you to potential issues, heat map in the code where you should look for vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been wanting to ask this to someone who has experience in both Web 2 auditing and Web 3 auditing. Do you think that the code, the bug density in smart contracts is a lot higher than traditional software?
That's a good question. Uh, I would like to say on like a project basis, it's probably a little bit less dense because I think that in Web two it's easy to kind of ignore the security problem because a vulnerability doesn't always mean your entire project is just wrecked overnight. But in Web three, the stakes are very high, so I think people tend to put a little bit more thought into things. But that said, as we just talked about, there's less code and it's more, I guess, logically dense. So I would say that in terms of line by line, there's probably more vulnerability density in Solidity code than there is in JavaScript code, for example.
Yeah, because it's always sort of surprised me. I mean, my background, I haven't done security auditing in Web 2 before, but sometimes I would just audit code that's only like 100 lines and then turn up with like 3 or 4 issues. It's kind of weird. Like, I don't think that that would turn up in traditional software.
Yeah, definitely not. Like when you think about like web application security as well, a lot of the issues are kind of distinct. Like you have cross-site scripting, you have cross-site request forgery, you have like access control. Like these things you're not really going to find all of those in one function per se. Well, I mean maybe, but it'd be kind of rare. But I think in Web 3 you can have easily, if you miscalculate a variable and then forget to put a certain modifier on something, you can easily have like 5 or 6 vulnerabilities stemming from that. So yeah, I think the logical density of smart contracts really can get us into trouble.
So whereas Audit Wizard at the moment in terms of functionality? Is it where you want it to be, or are you still building out issues to solve?
Yeah, the number I've quoted people in terms of percent completion has been around 20% feature complete. So we started with Audit Wizard just building a solid baseline that is basically this web based IDE, and it has the general workflow of you know uh, taking notes, logging a vulnerability, using scanning tools, using other analysis tools, using AI, and then creating a report out of that. That's kind of our foundation. And when you think about it, there's so many tools in the space. Right now, we have Slither integrated. We're working on Mithril and Pyrometer, and we have a lot of others on the roadmap. Um, but yeah, for now, we just have AI and Slither. So while the foundation is really solid and you can do your work there, there's so many more tools that we're going to bring to your fingertips. And on top of that, we have our own sort of unique features that we want to develop that really kind of require you have this more mature IDE system where you can actually build that out. And something I want to do is kind of rethink how auditors read code. So right now, when you pull up a code base, you're looking at just kind of a wall of text, right? And it's it's kind of a challenge, I think, to navigate that um, in a really intuitive way. And I think that code should good code is always intuitive, right? And you'll be able to audit best when you have that intuition on your side. And so the things that I've always wanted is to have like a full graph of the code that shows me, okay, what are the entry points? Where do those go? Maybe I can see a graph that has like, the chunks of code and then draws lines whenever there's a call to another function or another contract. And I can take that. Maybe you can even add some interactivity to that where I can have like a debugger and I can step through each line and I can see it as it goes through this kind of graph of code, how things are working. Uh, so I think there's a lot of visualization tools we want to add. There's a lot of interaction we want to add. Um, we also want to put in a lot of testing tools, more AI integrations. Like I want to make the system where we can basically use AI to write the boilerplate POC code for you, and then we can test that, run that on Foundry or something on our back end. So you can go from writing a vulnerability to having a proof of concept and then testing that, in a matter of minutes rather than having to context switch between all these different things. So we're really the approach we're taking is just zooming out and deconstructing everything an auditor does and thinking about what is the best way we can streamline that and make it really intuitive and make it like one click away for you. I think that the problem I'm trying to solve is two aspects to it. One, for auditors, I I think that a lot of people just don't do things and rely more on the manual uh, processes they have because there's a lot of friction to using a tool or to doing something in a certain way. Like there's friction to generating a graph of the code and then looking at that and then using that in tandem with the debugger, and getting a debugger to work and getting your environment set up properly. And you might just say like, screw it, I'm just going to read the code and then that's probably good enough. I don't want to waste my time on this. Want to solve that problem so that people can actually use those tools to make their work better and faster. And then I think the other problem that we feel really strongly about that is very pervasive in the Web3 space is the scaling problem. Um, you know, back in the height of the bull market, you'd have to pay almost six figures and wait 6 months to get an audit. And I said towards the beginning of the podcast that I think that developers and auditors are really not that far off. And so for Audit Wizard, we basically want to not only provide all of the tools uh, and like ease of access to these insights that we think that security professionals should have, but we want to also deconstruct what it means to be a security engineer and to do threat modeling and to think like an attacker and to do security analysis and bake that into the tool itself so that you as a developer, you don't exactly know what you need to know to be a good security engineer, but you know how to read code, you know how to think analytically about things. So if you can have this your handheld basically by Audit Wizard, um, and it can tell you like, hey, build a threat model, and here's AI to help you along the way, and here's all these other tools to help you think about things. And okay, you're done with that. Here's the next step in the security engineering process. And I think providing guidance and tooling are both equally important. We can get to a state where uh, developers can be auditing their own code and have a pretty good, reasonable level of security. I think people should always rely on an audit before they, by a security professional before they actually release something. But this will make security more accessible to a lot of projects that maybe can't afford that, or just have like a beta test they want to do, or even just as they build, don't want to dig themselves a technical debt hole that they then have to get out of.
Mm. So your goal is sort of have Audit Wizard be a tool that freelance auditors use and also help internal engineering teams with their DevSecOps process.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, I think that um, every developer can be an auditor, and especially if they use Audit
Has the threat model functionality been built into the AI yet?
Yeah, so right now it's a little bit basic. You can open up Auto Wizard, and we have this like tool you can click on, the AI tool, and it does two things. One, it just has like an analysis function, and that will break down what the contract does, and it will give you sort of like a list of threats. So it will kind of seed that threat model for you. And the second thing it can do is it's essentially like a chatbot, right? You can go back and forth with the AI, and that's where you can kind of expand on those specifics, and you can ask it. Um, Maybe you give it a little bit extra context, like, "Hey, this is using a chain link oracle to do this thing, and that's how that works." So, given that and the context you already have of the code, do you think there's any other threats that I should be adding to my threat model? So, as I said, you have to really give an AI a very specific problem, um, and if you just say, "Give me a threat model," it can do that, and we have that. But I think you should definitely take it a step further and kind of use it as your kind of your buddy, your guide in exploring those threats. Like when I, outside of security, when I am trying to think of something, like if I want to uh, write something, I might ask the AI like, what are different ways I can write this sentence, or like what are different words I could use to convey this idea. I think that AI should be used in the same way for threat modeling. You know, here's all the thoughts that I have. What do you think as the AI could be added to this list of threats that I should go look at?
Mm, nice, interesting. So, I guess from a business perspective, are you at all concerned that the Web3 security space is too small at the moment? Because there were some discussions this week around how many people uh, actually are a freelance auditor in this space, and it doesn't turn out to be that big of a number. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the number is a little small, but the rate of growth we see is pretty big for an industry anyway, especially in the security space. Um, I've seen a lot of freelance auditors, um, or I guess aspiring freelance auditors in the Web3 space, kind of take on that challenge of learning, um, you know, smart contract security as kind of their first foray into something technical, right? Or they just really like blockchains and smart contracts, and they wanted to find some way to make a living off that. And then they decide that auditing is a really attractive way because you can be sort of nomadic, and you can have a good influx of work, if you're a good auditor. So I think that while it is a little small now, we're going to see explosive growth, especially around the next bull market. I think it's going to attract a lot more people. But even now, in the bear market, where we're seeing a lot of people get into the space, even just as like non-technical people wanting to do something technical for once. And that's kind of what we're banking on. I mean, I said that the two problems we're solving are making it, uh, allowing developers to audit their own code and then making auditors' lives easier. But I think maybe the third thing you could add to that would be just making security easier to do, right? So making auditing a less hard problem, so that those more nascent people that want to break into the space um, have a lot less friction, and they can actually, uh, go through the path of learning about Solidity, maybe trying out some, auditing contests or bug bounties, and then building their skills from there, taking those baby steps along the way, and then eventually becoming full-fledged auditors. And that was my experience coming into the space. Is I tried to go from learning to bounties to becoming a full-fledged auditor, and I saw there's friction every step of the way. So hopefully the future will be that people can more easily get into the space, and we'll see a lot more growth.
Nice, nice. So, how is Audit Wizard available at the moment? Is it free? Is it subscription based?
Yeah, it's currently free, so we're in a beta test right now. So you can go to auditwizard.io and you can access the beta. You just have to make an account and you can start using it right away. In the future, there will be sort of a paid tier that has some more powerful features and you know increased rate limits, so you can interact with the AI more. You can run more scans, um, and access some of the more you know powerful features that we'll add in the future. But there will always be a free tier for Audit Wizard. I said before that we, in the beginning, started to think about how we could build this as a public good, and I think in a lot of ways we still are kind of aligned with that vision. And so there will always be a free aspect to Audit Wizard that allows you to use the baseline of the product to find vulnerabilities and access this web-based IDE to do your work. Uh, but if that works for you, then there's going to be a paid tier to allow you to step your game up as a professional and be even more streamlined.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, Joe. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and thanks for having me.